Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So before I get into the content of this video, I want to let people know that if you are in the Baltimore area, we're going to have an in-person discussion of this book, Kindred by Octavia Butler. That will be on July 27th at 1 p.m. and it will be at the Terra Cafe. I will include a link in the description box and also in the comment sections to the invite so that you all can click that link and indicate whether or not you are interested. Hopefully people will come out and meet me in person. I would love to talk to you all about this in person, have a full discussion and engaging discussion about this. But for this particular video, what I'm going to do is touch on some very important questions and themes that were raised by this book. It's a powerful book. I highly recommend that people read it. If you have not read the book and you don't want any spoilers, it's probably a good idea to watch this video after you have read the book. And I hope that you all can, again, come out and meet me in person and talk to me in person about this book. Again, that's July 27th at 1 p.m. at the Terra Cafe here in Baltimore. And I may do a live stream where we talk about it as well. I may actually do the discussion live on Facebook and YouTube. But I have to think about that. Let me know what y'all think about that. So this book right here, Kindred by Octavia Butler, it's like a mixture between history and science fiction because you have a situation where the main character by the name of Dana gets transported to the past, to the days of slavery. And each time she's transported back to slavery times, she is basically there to rescue or to save this character by the name of Rufus, who's at first he's a young boy who is, the son of a slave owner, in slavery times in Maryland. Um, so she meets him first as a little boy. She saves his life as a little boy. So there are various incidents that occur. Like one time he's drowning, another time he falls from a tree, another time there's a fire, and etc. There's a storm. So every time this character Rufus is in danger, Dana, who was an African American woman from the 1970s, is transported back to the past to rescue and help this boy. And then when he grows up, she rescues him as a grown man various times. And when she goes back in time, she experiences slavery. She's actually transported to a slave plantation, and she is treated like a slave. And through this experience, we learn a lot about slavery. We learn, some details about the history of slavery and just about the oppressive nature of slavery. And many of us know a lot of this stuff, but this book makes it very real. Even though this is a work of fiction, you can tell that it's rooted in actual facts of the history of slavery. And I think that reading this book at this time is right on time because here's a time where people are talking about reparations for slavery. And, I just think that this is an on point, on time type of discussion. Now, one of the themes that comes to mind as I was reading this book, reading about this black woman who's being transported to the past to help this white slave master, this white boy who eventually becomes a slave master. She's transported to help him. And I just think about how we too often go out of our way to save and defend our oppressors, and this is the example of it. Here you have this black woman who is defending this slave master, saving a slave master, saving somebody that would eventually go on to be a slave master. And there's an interesting twist to this. This woman is actually related to this man, Rufus, this white man. And we know that this is a part of the history of slavery, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is a key theme, this idea of rescuing the slave master, defending the slave master. And that's what a lot of us find ourselves doing, defending, for instance, police brutality. In this modern day and age, you have many personalities here on YouTube who will go out of their way to rationalize police brutality, go out of their way to defend cops that kill black people, go out of their way to defend white people who make racist statements. It makes me think of examples like a Candace Owens, for instance, who defended the wrongful prosecution of the Central Park Five, you know, those brothers who were wrongfully convicted of the Central Park rape. You know, she basically justified that. That's another example of somebody defending the slave master. You have Clarence Thomas, and I'm probably going to do a separate video on this on my I Declare War channel talking about these people. Like you have a Clarence Thomas, for instance, defending um, a prosecutor who tried to exclude black jurors from juries. So you have many examples of modern day black people who go out of their way to defend the slave master, modern day Uncle Ruckuses, modern day mammies. And in some ways, this main character, Dana, kind of played that role of the mammy, of the, you know, the Uncle Ruckus type of character. So that's one thing that has to be discussed. Another point is this, you know, indoctrination is a major theme in this particular book. You know, the indoctrination of the oppressed and of the oppressor. Um, for instance, this character Rufus had been indoctrinated to be racist towards black people, you know, calling black people niggers, treating black people like property. So he had been indoctrinated, you know, indoctrinated by his father who owned slaves. And you had this character, Dana, who figured that, well, if she treated this kid, you know, in a nice way, and she showed him how she was intelligent, because this is a woman from the future who's well educated, well spoken, unlike the slaves who lived on a plantation. She was able to express herself in certain ways because she knew the language, you know, she was educated. Also, she knew how to read, and the slave master didn't even know how to read like that, like she could, and all that kind of stuff. Wasn't nowhere near as intelligent as she was. So she thought that perhaps that she could educate this boy, you know, by coming back to him and talking to him and trying to communicate with him and trying to make him empathize with the plight of black people, that somehow this would reform him, somehow this would save him from embracing the racist views of his father and of his generation. But as you will see in the book, that was a complete failure, you know, and it's just a reminder that there is no hope for some of these racist white people. You know, a lot of these racist white people are lost cause. You know, they have surrendered to racism, and it is a waste of time and energy trying to change their mindset a lot of times. So that's one thing. So you have the indoctrination of the oppressor, but you also have the indoctrination of the oppressed. And there was, you know, one compelling statement in the book that really caught my attention. And that's when the character Dana, you know, observes slave children actually engaged in play, you know, and they are basically reenacting a slave auction, a slave sale, and all that kind of stuff, uh, acting out slavery because that's all they knew. You know, that's the world that they knew. You know, they didn't have any other type of perceptions of reality. So they actually enacted slavery and played like they were selling one another and all that kind of stuff. And she says this, she said, I never realized how easily people could be indoctrinated. So you had these children at a very young age already being indoctrinated to be slaves, to be servants, to be somebody else's property. And it's just so sad, man. And thinking about that, you know, that particular scene where you had these kids acting out, being enslaved, embracing slavery as their reality. It made me think about how our people today are indoctrinated. Um, you know, you have the example where children are presented with two dolls, you know, one is white and one is black. You know, they did that test way back in the 50s during the Brown versus the Board of Education case. And you've had modern people try to reenact that test. And you got to have the same results. Like all these years after slavery, all these years after Jim Crow, you still have a great number of black children, when asked which doll is the beautiful doll, they point to the white doll. Which doll is the good doll, they point to the white doll. Which doll is the intelligent doll, they point to the white doll. Even today, we are indoctrinated to be slaves, to see ourselves as inferior to this white man, to buy into the myth and lie of white supremacy. And it's no surprise, because early on, just like the children in that book were taught to be indoctrinated, early on our children are taught to be indoctrinated. Early on, they're taught that white is more beautiful than black. Early on, they're taught about, the white woman being the standard of beauty. They're given stories like Snow White, given stories about like Rapunzel, and all these stories have white princesses in them. They're given dolls like Barbie dolls with the long straight hair and the pale white skin that teaches them that that's beautiful. That's what beauty looks like. So it's no wonder that we see a lot of our sisters running around here with foreign hair on top of their real hair, covering up their real hair with wigs and weaves and stuff like that, because they have been indoctrinated to embrace white supremacy, indoctrinated to believe that white people are better than them, that white people are more beautiful to them than they are, that white people are the standard and all that kind of stuff. And this indoctrination continues in education. We open these textbooks and, we go to these classes, and Black history is mentioned as like some kind of footnote. The only thing that we learn about ourselves primarily when we go to, middle school and high school, and even in some colleges, you learn that you were just some slaves. And that's one of the problems that I have with this, ADOS movement, where your whole identity is just tied to slavery and stuff. You don't learn about the great kingdoms that Black people had. You don't learn about how Black people were the founders of human civilization. The creator of mathematics and science and medicine and philosophy and religion and all that kind of stuff. Instead, you just learn that we were some savages that were rescued by the white man. You learn that somehow this white man did us a favor by enslaving us. This is the indoctrination that we're facing. So that's a point that I had to make. Another point is this. This story highlights the horrors of slavery in a very vivid way. Very vivid and very powerful, man. They show you and tell you about the beatings of slaves. It's one thing to just know about it, like just the idea of slaves being beat. But it's like when you see it through, stories where they're telling you how the slave is strung up, when they're telling you about how the slave is beaten, tell you about the actual pain that the slave experiences, tell you about the recovery process, when they tell you about the traumatic impact that it has on the individual slave, it is very powerful. And just as other people embrace their history, we have to embrace our history and confront our history. They tell you about how families were separated, how children were sold off away from their mothers and fathers and stuff like that, split up. And they basically showed how that was basically used as a weapon to control slaves. Like if a slave did something the master didn't like, the master would sell off the children to control that slave. And there's one point in here where this character, Alice, is told that her children have been sold off because she did something that the master didn't approve of. And this hurts this woman so bad. It strikes her to the core to such a degree that she commits suicide. And there's even more to it. Like, this also talks about the raping of Black women, how Black women had no control over their bodies, their own bodies. Here you had a free Black woman who was living during slavery times. This woman, this character, Alice, she was married to this man, Isaac. And you had a slave master, this white slave master that I mentioned before, Rufus, who wanted this Black woman. He desired this Black woman so much that he was, that he decided to, take this Black woman. And, eventually what happened was the black woman's husband attacked the slave master, beat him, severely. This slave master was jealous of this man who was with the African woman, Alice. And, he had all these things to say, and he was trying to take this woman away from this man's wife, from this man who was married to this woman. So the man got into a confrontation, this black man, he attacks this slave master, beats him severely, and they run away. Alice and this character, Isaac, run away. And they're later captured and severely punished and stuff like that. Isaac, for instance, has his ears chopped off, and then he's sold off to another slave master, far away in Mississippi. Again, they were in Maryland, and he's sold off to Mississippi. So you had a marriage ripped apart. It's like, even though we weren't like legally allowed to get married, you had black people trying to marry, trying to maintain marriages, but that didn't matter to the slave master. He didn't care anything about this woman's marriage. He wanted this black woman, and that's what he eventually did. He had his way with her. He raped her. And, they talk about this issue of rape, and I just think that it is horrific that our women had to go through this, that they were raped by the slave master. Often we use terms like, Negro bedwench and all that kind of stuff. And we basically try to tie the plight of black women during slavery times to the plight of black women today, in terms of these black women that sell out and just want to be with the white man. But our sisters that were enslaved, they didn't have any choice but to be with this white man. He imposed his will on them. He raped them. He abused them. And, this story just goes into detail about that. Talks about how, these women were violated. And, one of the sad things, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is about how a lot of times black people cooperated with their slave master. They helped their slave master oppress black people. And, while we're talking about this thing of, interracial relationships, you have, in the case of rape, that's not a relationship at all. It's an interracial abuse, sexual abuse, rape, and all that kind of stuff. But you have this main character, Dana, who it turns out she's actually married to a white man in the story. And that made me wonder, like, why would this writer, Octavia Butler, have this main character being married to a white man? And then at the same time, one of the key villains in this book is a white man. So it's like, what kind of message is she trying to send? Why did she have this character married to a white man? And then, they talk about like that character and how her parents reacted and family members reacted when she decided to get with this white man. For instance, one of her uncles says, well, I'm not going to, give any of my property to you because I don't want it going to a white man. And I think that that's, a valid, legitimate concern. For instance, today you have all these black athletes, for instance, who, gain all this wealth and fame and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of times, and it's not just the athletes, it's also actors and other prominent black people. They gain a certain degree of wealth and power and influence. And the first thing that they do is they marry a white woman or some other non-black woman a lot of times. And what ends up happening is you have money and wealth, instead of it being concentrated in the black community, it goes outside of the black community. Because when these white women either divorce these guys, or when the guy passes away, that money goes to that white woman and her biracial children and stuff like that. And it's taken out of the black community. So I think that that was a legitimate concern that was raised by this character who was her uncle in this book. Also, they talked about how one of her relatives, I can't remember if it's her mother or aunt or whatever, but one of her relatives was only happy about this interracial relationship or marriage because of the prospect of having light children, biracial children. And we know that, again, going back to this indoctrination, we know that a lot of our people have bought into this lie of white supremacy. They have embraced colorism, where they view lighter skin as more attractive. And I remember back in the day, like women talking about, well, I want to get a light skin man, so I have children with light skin and good hair and all that kind of stuff. And people still use that terminology today. They still talk about good hair, meaning hair that resembles white hair, hair that is straight, hair that is non-African, not curly or kinky and all that kind of stuff, not quote unquote nappy, but straight hair. So we're deeply indoctrinated, man. So you do have a lot of these people that, embrace these interracial relationships because they want to have light children that don't even resemble them. And that's what happens a lot of times. These people get in these interracial relationships and they have these very light children that don't even look anything like them. And they think that that's something great. They think that, diluting their bloodline is some kind of sign of progress, some sign of, racial tolerance and all that kind of stuff. So another theme that I want to touch on is the fear of knowledge. You all know that during slavery times, it was forbidden for Africans to learn how to read and write and all that kind of stuff because they feared the power of knowledge. Like when slaves were able to gain knowledge and read for themselves, they began to be able to shape their own reality and to define things for themselves. Like, for instance, when, a Nat Turner would read the Bible, instead of being force fed an interpretation designed to oppress black people, this brother was able to read it for himself and decide and interpret it for himself. And he used that book as a tool for black liberation. It inspired a rebellion. And that's what they were fearful of. People gaining knowledge and also the power of the word. Like when people had the ability to read, they could create passes, for instance, that would allow them to travel. Slaves had to have documents written up that would give them a pass to travel certain places. And when people had knowledge and they were able to read, they could make a fake pass and all that kind of stuff. And that's what the slave master feared. So that was a big theme in this story, the fear of people learning. So you had the main character, Dana, who was from the 20th century, from the 1970s, going back in time to slavery days. And she was educating people. She was teaching some of the slaves how to read. And, of course, the slave master didn't like that. But the slave master had no problem with her actually teaching the slave master's children how to read and all that kind of stuff. And that brings me, I want to go back to a point about like the horrors of slavery. One thing that's very horrific in this is like how these slave masters actually enslaved their own children. Like they would have children with these African slaves and they would enslave these children, sell these children, treat them just like they would treat any other slave. And, that just shows like the devilish nature of slavery, the wicked nature of it. So I had to highlight that point because, that's part of this issue with I was talking about how the slave master had no problem with her teaching his children how to read, but not his not his biracial children, but his white child. He had no problem with, the white child learning how to read. And later on, this white slave master, Russell, had no problem with his children learning how to read and stuff like that. Another point that has to be touched on is like the genetic ties between the slave master and the slave. Like that's one of the main reasons why this character, Dana, doesn't just kill the slave master because he's her distant relative. Like, he hooks up with this character, Alice. He actually rapes her and all that kind of stuff. And they have offspring. And those offspring are Dana's descendants and stuff. So she knows that if she wipes him out, then she's wiping out her own existence and changing her own existence. So that's part of the reason why she doesn't just straight take him out, like after all the horrors that this guy commits in the book. But it just made me think about our ties to slavery. Like, most African Americans have the slave master's blood running through their veins. Most of us do. That's part of the reason why you have all these different this rainbow of colors in the black community, from very fair black people to very dark black people. Now, there was some variance on the continent, like all Africans weren't the same complexion. You have darker Africans and lighter Africans and all that kind of stuff. But in America, we see that there's a lot of, a huge variation in complexions in the black community, and that's because of, the history of slavery and also intermarriage. So that made me think about these ties that we have with our slave master. And these ties change, fundamentally affect who we are as a people, changed our, physical makeup, and then just the interaction that we have with this white culture has affected us in a way that's profound. Like, we are not the same Africans that we were when we came to this continent. A lot of our culture has been fundamentally changed and in many cases wiped out because of these ties that we have with this slave master. Now, I mentioned the character Alice and, her escaping from the slave master and, running away from the slave master and the slave master raping her and all that kind of stuff. Well, again, she was captured, like after she ran away. Um, she ran away and everything, and she was captured. Now, once she was captured, she was severely beaten. And as I told you all, her husband was beaten severely. His ears were chopped off and he was sold to a slave master in Mississippi or somewhere else, far away. And, because of this beating and because of the trauma of that experience, the character Alice had to go through recovery. Like, she went for a long time where she was in very bad condition. She was in such a bad state that she had completely lost her memory. She did not remember what happened. She didn't even know that she was a slave. And at some point in the book, she asked the character Dana if she was a slave. She asked, like, am I a slave? And all this and that. And at first, Dana is hesitant to tell her the truth about herself and her condition. But eventually she decides to go ahead and explain the situation, to let her know what's going on, let her know that yes, she was a slave. Yes, she tried to run away and she was captured by the slave master and severely beaten. And she tells her about her husband and what happened to him. And after Alice gains this information and this knowledge of self, it's literally knowledge of herself. And I think that that's what this that part of the story is about gaining knowledge of self and its impact on people once they have knowledge of self. So when she gains this knowledge of self, learning that she was a slave, learning that she had tried to escape, learning that her husband was beaten severely, disfigured and, having his ears chopped off and sewed off and all that kind of stuff. And then when she learns that she's a slave, and that this slave master basically wanted to keep her for himself and rape her and all that kind of stuff. She becomes enraged, and that's just how it is when Black people gain knowledge of self. When we understand what's going on, when we understand what time it is, a natural reaction is to be enraged. And that reminded me of the quote from James Baldwin when he says, "To be Black and conscious in America is to be in a state is to be in a constant state of rage." So let me repeat that: to be Black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. And that's basically what you had here. You had a situation where this woman was so outraged when she gained this knowledge of self. So outraged. And that's how we are. When we understand the history that our people have gone through and the experience that our people go through today, one can't help but be enraged. When you understand, like, the criminal justice system and the system of mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow, when you understand the wicked nature of the police apparatus, the police state in America that systematically targets and eliminates black men and women, you can't help but be enraged. When you look at a system that deliberately pumped drugs into black communities and then incarcerated black people for using and selling drugs, you can't help but be enraged. So, I think that the story of Alice and like her reaction to gaining knowledge of self is a parable, or a symbol for what black people go through when we gain knowledge of self and when we gain consciousness. Another thing that has to be talked about is the house Negro. Like, that's a common theme that goes on throughout this book. This main character, Dana, is essentially a house Negro for a good part of the book because, she's constantly saving the slave master. And it reminds me of Malcolm's speech when he talks about how the house Negro loves the master more than the master loves his own self. How when the master's house is on fire, the the house Negro is quick to put out the fire. When the master is sick, the house Negro is talking about, what's the matter, boss? We sick? And that's basically what this character Dana was doing. Like, she, throughout this book, like, she was caring for this guy, literally helping to strengthen him when he was sick, when he was injured, and all that kind of stuff. And literally helping to save this slave master's lives, in the hopes that somehow he would change or be different. But throughout this book, he is still brutal towards her. And, brutal towards slaves, period, and towards her. And, that's one thing about the house Negro. Like, they may enjoy certain privileges and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, they're just a slave like any other slave. Just like this character Dana, like, she had education. She was an articulate Negro, a knowledgeable Negro, a writer and all that kind of stuff. So in some ways, she was treated differently than the other slaves, but at the end of the day, she was still beaten by the slave master. At the end of the day, the slave master attempted to rape her. So in many respects, she was no different from any other slave. And that's how it is today with the house Negro. Like, a lot of these people, they figure that because they get a certain status and all that kind of stuff, that somehow they're going to be treated differently than any other black person and all that kind of stuff. But we've seen time and time again how the slave master will turn his back on the house Negro and abandon the house Negro and abuse the house Negro. But yeah, so you have that situation. And then you have, like, for instance, this character, Dana, not only saving the slave master's life, not only helping him to get strong, like when he was sick or when he was injured or something like that, she actually convinces this character, Alice, to go back to the slave master, because the slave master says, I want this slave to be mine. This Alice character, he basically was like infatuated with this character. And he wanted to have sex with this character and to be with this character. And he called on Dana, the main character, to convince Alice to go back with him, to go back to the slave master's quarters and all that kind of stuff. And she does that. She goes ahead and convinces this character to go back with this guy. And this guy ends up, raping Alice over and over again, abusing her. He has children with her, and then he pretends like he sold the children off. And then Alice commits suicide, as I mentioned before. And it's like, I wonder, like, if that would have even happened, if it probably would have happened anyway without Dana, but it's like Dana helped that situation. And then you have a situation where Dana at some point gets so angry with the slave master, Rufus, because he hides some letters that she sent out, trying to get her husband back and all that kind of stuff. It's a long story, but I won't go into the details. But she's angry at this guy because he does this. So she decides, well, there's no hope. This guy has lied to me. He's done all these evil things. So I'm going to run away, just like any other slave. So she tries to run away. And then one of the slaves tells the master that she runs away. And that's the only reason why the master was able to apprehend her, catch her right away. And it's just like, that's one of the things, like these house Negroes selling out, their own black people. It's a disgrace that you would have that happen, but it's happened time and time again. Like when you've had slave rebellions being plotted, you had, these informants amongst the slaves, these sellouts and turncoats and, Judases amongst the slaves go back and report to the master about what's going on. And it's sad that we have had to deal with that situation then and that we still deal with it today. And then, that reminds me of the whole divide and conquer thing. Like you had this character, Alice, who was, rightfully outraged. But a lot of her outrage, instead of being directed at the slave master, ended up being directed primarily at this character, Dana. And that's even before, some of this stuff happened. So it's just like, this misdirected rage that we have, is a problem as well. And that kind of reminds me, as I was telling my friend the other day, of, something Frantz Fanon was talking about, how the oppressed often lash out at each other because they can't lash out at the oppressor. And that keeps us in a posture of being divided and conquered. So that's a point that I had to raise. And there's a couple of other points that I want to raise before I close out. And I want to ask a couple of questions. So you have at the very end, like after the story has been resolved and everything, and where the character's not being forced to go back to the past. The main character again, Dana, decides, well, I want to actually visit this place where this plantation was in modern times. So she goes back to the place, and she asks, why would I even want to come here? You would have thought I've had enough of the past, because she had been projected back and forth to the past. And she saw the horrors of slavery. And she's talking about, like, why would I even want to go back there after that experience? And that made me think about people trying to avoid our history. People basically saying, well, slavery is so horrific. I don't want to see any films about slavery. I don't want to read about slavery. I don't want to hear about, horrible things that happen to our people. Because, a lot of people feel like they don't want to experience that trauma. They don't want to think about that trauma. They want to wipe it out of their memory. And to some degree, I understand that. But I think that when people take that kind of posture, they are disrespecting the suffering of our ancestors. They're disrespecting the ancestors. All these other people, when they have experienced trauma, when there has been some Holocaust or something to that effect, their slogan is never again, and they talk about how they'll never forget. After the Holocaust in Germany, the Jews said they'll never forget. After 9/11, people said they would never forget. After Pearl Harbor, people said they would never forget. But when it comes to the African in America, we want to forget our history. When it comes to the African in America, American society wants to forget the history of slavery and the legacy of Jim Crow. That's why they don't want to touch the question of reparations, because that they know that that's a deep and profound question. That's something that needs to be discussed, but they avoid it. Just like we avoid our history. We want to ignore our history. And that's a shame, man. We need to honor our ancestors. Remember our ancestors. Not forget them. You had people even, for instance, wanting to avoid watching the show about the plight of those young men who were wrongfully charged with the Central Park rape and, wrongfully convicted. They don't want to hear that story because of the rage that it brings about when they learn that, when they watch that particular film, when they see the injustice. And to a degree, again, I understand that, but we have to embrace our history if we are to move forward as a people. So those are my thoughts about the book. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. It raises great questions, and I would welcome and I would love to have an opportunity to discuss this with you all in person. So if you are in Baltimore or nearby, come out on July 27th so that we can have an in-person discussion at the Terra Cafe here in Baltimore at 1 p.m. So I hope you can join that. And I'm interested in what you all have to say about this book. Have you read the book? If you read the book, what do you think? What points did I miss in this discussion? Um, what other things were raised in this particular book? What other points or highlights do you think I should have mentioned in this video right now? Now, when I read this book, one of the first questions that came to my mind is this: like, what would I do, or what would you do if you were transported back to the days of slavery? What would you do? How would you deal with the situation? And we know a lot of people are going to say, you know, they would fight back, they would be a rebel and all this and that. But it's one thing to think about slavery from, you know, just theoretically. It's quite another thing when you are actually experiencing the suffering and the conditions of slavery, where this white man has control over your life and death. You know, so it's one thing to talk all that rah-rah stuff theoretically, but what would you do in reality, man? And that's a question that my brother raised. Like, you know, on Facebook, I asked this question on my personal page, and I got a wide range of responses, and he was just real with it. Because it's easy to talk all this militant stuff when we are not living under slavery. And the same people that talk all this militant stuff, they're not that militant in real life, in their real lives. You know, the same people talking this militant stuff, when they are confronted by the police, they clam up just like any other person. When they have to deal with racism on the job and stuff like that, or snide remarks from their boss and all that kind of stuff, they clam up, they freeze up, they do nothing. But yet they want us to believe that they're going to be some great freedom fighter. They're going to be Nat Turner if they went back to slavery times. And then there's another thing that I wanted to ask about. If you could bring something with you to those slave times, what would you bring with you? Because during the story, the character Dana, you know, every time that she's transported back to slavery times, like right before she's transported, she makes sure that she brings a package, you know, of different items with her, like medicine, a knife, and some other things, a map or something like that, so that she'll have the things that she needs when she goes back into that time. And what I want to ask you is, what would you bring with you if you had to go back to the past? I know I have some ideas, but I want to hear from y'all. But with that, you know, I want to say peace and blessing to y'all. I want to thank y'all for tuning in. You know, I truly appreciate it. Again, I will be back on here live soon. You know, once I get these quirks figured out with my internet. You know, my internet connection is bad, so I don't want to have something that's going to be buffering and all that. And even when I use my phone, I have a couple of issues. But once I work those issues out, I'll be back on here live with my content. And also, I encourage you all to support this channel, like the video, share the video, hit that notification bell so that you'll know when I post new content. And also, financially support this channel. If you support this message, put your money where your mouth is so that we can continue to put forth this content. You know, you have other content providers who, you know, make money off of degrading women. You know, they have a lot of people financially supporting them, you know, voting with their dollars to support people. If we want alternative messaging, if we want empowering messaging, then we need to support that messaging, you know, not only with our views, but with our dollars. So with that, I'm going to say peace and blessings to each and every one of you. Thanks for watching. Hopefully soon I'll have a video on my I Declare War channel as well, so subscribe to that channel as well. Peace.